And no, this is Micah Wood. He is a good friend of mine. Can I say that? A good friend, great friend.
Depends on the intro, Chris.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he's going to be talking. I'm going to fix all the things that he says incorrectly. You know, so. WordPress developers have been doing it since 2008, 9, somewhere around there. So, figured out the plugins, wrote a theme framework that my company uses all the time, and probably the best WordPress developer that I know. So he's going to be talking about hooks and filters. So that is. Oh, yeah, we could do announcements. So I don't know what the announcements are. I should have pulled those up. So we do meetups every Thursday at 11:30 at this location. We have next week. Is that the
next week's that is Kathy. So
okay?
Next week's not this location.
Okay. So 2 weeks from now in this room, we'll be talking about plugins. I actually read the little thing there. So it's going to be more of a discussion. I don't think it's going to be a panel, right?
Right.
So
yeah, it's kind of a big panel.
Yeah, big panel, just talking about which plugins you guys use, which ones are better, which ones are worse, et cetera, et cetera. And I've got the meetup in Atlanta that I do the second Wednesday each month at 7 o'clock, and then the fourth Wednesday at 11:30. So, I don't think many of you guys make it downtown, so except for one person. So. Anyway.
The important one is this developer group will not meet next month.
Right. We're not meeting in June because many of us are going to be in Asheville for WordCamp. So we'll see you back in July.
Yeah, how many of you guys are going to Asheville? Or just okay. So the important people will be there. So Mickey will lead the. No, just kidding.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm at the beach that week. I knew I had something that week too, so yeah.
Gotcha.
All right, so so Micah Wood. I work currently at a company called Norwell Digital, which is an agency here in Atlanta. My Twitter handle is WP Scholar, and I also have a site where I haven't lately, but do blog, WPScholar.com. So WordPress hooks. For those, how many people are actually familiar with what a WordPress hook is? All right. For those that are not, hook is the generic name for something. We have two types of hooks. There's actions and filters. So we're going to kind of discuss what both of those are today. So if you hear the word hook, it's just the generic term for either one. So the first thing we're going to start out with is actions. So what is an action? An action is basically nothing more than an event. So if you just replace the word event with action with event, it'll make maybe a little bit more sense to you if you're not familiar with it. But essentially, WordPress has things that happen at specific times. As WordPress loads, it essentially triggers events, and you can tap into those as you go along. So an action basically kind of has, there's two main parts to it. There's the trigger, right, the thing that actually triggers the event. So it allows you to fire some sort of code in some sort of context, right? Like you know that something has happened, therefore you want to do something. A very dumbed down example would be when Jill comes by, send her to the store for milk, right? You don't want to send her to the store for milk until she comes by, because if you say, hey, go to the store for milk and she's not there, it's not going to work, right? So same kind of idea. You just have some sort of event you want to tap into, and then you actually have a listener. And the listener just listens for that event, whatever that event is, and runs some code. So if you've ever looked, how many people here have edited a WP config file? So if you've ever looked down at the bottom of that WP config file, there's a file that it loads called WP settings, right? And inside of there, there's a series of actions, and it kind of gives you an idea of what things happen in WordPress, just kind of a broad sense. So, for example, these are the actions that fire. So we have MU plugins loaded, which is must-use plugins. If you're not familiar with those are kind of cool. And then plugins loaded, which basically means that all the normal plugins have loaded, and you can fire some sort of custom code on that event. Setup theme happens right before the theme actually gets set up, and then after setup theme is the first hook that you're actually able to use inside of the theme, right? Because your theme just got set up, and now you can actually tap into some sort of action. Then there's something called a net, which is a very common thing to hook into for things like registering post types or any kind of general setup things you might need to do. And there's also a hook called WP loaded, which basically says, hey, WordPress is done loading. If there's anything you want to do now before we display content, go ahead and do that. So, and these are just a few of the actions that WordPress has. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands. But basically, the way that these things get triggered is do action, right? So that's the function that triggers an action. And you can actually use these in your own custom code. If you've got a plugin or you want to do some, maybe you've got a theme you're releasing or something like that, and you don't know how people are going to use your code, you can actually trigger events at certain points in your code and allow other people to tap into those. So then we have add action. And add action basically is the custom code that you're hooking in, right? So we want to hook into the save post action. So when the post gets saved, we want to do something. So we have this my function function, and we call that when save post happens. And so therefore we can do our custom code when that event happens. So these are all different ways that you could potentially register your own custom code. They all potentially could do the same thing as far as the custom code. But these are just different ways that you could actually register that, right? So this first example on the top line here is a regular function. So it's just a string that contains the name of the function you want to call. It could be a WordPress function, it could be a custom function you've written, whatever that may be. The second line, you'll notice there's a number there. That's an optional parameter. It basically says what the priority for that code is. So by default, any action hook that you register, like on the first line there with no number, that number is basically going to be assumed to be 10, right? So if you make the number smaller, like 9 or 8, or anything all the way up to 1, I've never tried 0, but I'm assuming it would work. But basically, if you have a lower number, that means that thing's going to trigger first, right? So it goes in numeric order from 0 to whatever. If you want to do something after that, you can register on 11 or 99 or whatever you want it to do. So that's how you control the priority. This third line here, if you happen to be trying to add an action inside of a class, you can do it in this format. You pass the variable that contains the instance of your class and the name of the function or method in that class you want to call. If you are working within the context of a static class, you can pass in the class variable or the name of the class if you're not inside of it, and the static method. Or this last version here, you see we actually have the function there in line. That's called an anonymous function. Those of you who may be familiar with that in JavaScript would probably be more familiar. A lot of times in PHP, people aren't sure what that is, or it's kind of a newer feature, so sometimes people don't use it, but you can actually define that right there inside of that code. And so you see this function has two parameters, post ID and post. And the save post action, when it gets fired, it actually passes those two variables in so that you can have a little bit more context about what's going on, right? So just because a post saved, you don't really know what post actually saved, but this particular action allows you to access the post ID and the actual post object.
Question.
Yeah.
What version of PHP is that available in? Is that
5.3?
5.3?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So then you'll also notice there's a 10 and a 2, and that 10 basically is the same thing as a priority, right? So we're saying that priority is 10 normal. But there's the 2, and anytime you have more than one variable that you're trying to access in the function, so you have 2 parameters there, you'll need to set that to the number of parameters you're expecting to get. So if I set post ID and post there as parameters for that function, and I didn't pass the number 2, I'm actually only going to get post ID, and if I try to use post, I'll just get errors. It's kind of a legacy thing, but I have to set the number of things that are parameters for that function. And that works across the board, no matter how you register it, whether it's an anonymous function, an actual callback function inside a class, or whatever the case is. So beyond being able to add an action, you also have the ability to remove an action. So there's a function called remove action. You can pass in the name of the event that you want to remove the action for, and the name of the function that you want to remove. So in this case, we can undo exactly what we just did, right? We can say save post, my function, and now we'll remove that, and that code won't run. So this seems kind of silly, but if you have a plugin that registers an action, and then you have another plugin that wants to do it better, right? You might want to remove that action and add your own. So depending on what's going on, it can be very handy. You'll notice there is no remove action with the anonymous function, and that's the only problem with using anonymous functions, is that works great if you're working on your own custom code that it's never going to see the light of day as far as the public, but you can't actually remove actions that have anonymous functions. So that's kind of one of the downsides to it. So if you are releasing anything publicly, that's not the best way to go.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Why do you have on the second one down, the preference, the 10, why is that there at all if you just remove it?
So you can potentially have the same function registered under different priorities,
Gotcha.
in which case you might want to remove one and not the other for some reason. Maybe you just realize that a plugin did it wrong and they did it twice in different priorities, and you want to remove the one so it's more conformant, or whatever the case is. But yeah, it's possible that you could do that. So then we also have the ability to remove all actions, which is a little bit dangerous, but there are times where it could be appropriate. But essentially, you can pass in the name of the event, and it will remove all custom code, WordPress code included, that may be hooked into that. And if you happen to provide a priority, it will not unregister everything. It will just unregister everything at that specific priority level. You can also check to see if something has an action. So you can say, so that first line there, has action save post, basically says, are there any callbacks associated with save post at all? And if there are, it will return true. If not, it will return false. These other ones are just, again, multiple examples of how you can check a specific function and see if there is a specific function or callback for that save post action anywhere in the code. So if you happen to register it and you're wondering, well, maybe some other plugin undid it, let me just check and see if it's there.
So those all return Boolean values?
Correct. And yeah, it's just important to realize that whatever method you use to register something is also the way you need to check to see if it exists, or the same way that you need to remove it. You can't switch around how you do that. There's also a did action, so you can check and see if an action actually occurred. So if you call did action on save post and no post was saved, it'll actually return 0. And it's possible that save post could be fired multiple times. So what this is actually going to give you is the number of times that thing happened. So if it happened at least once, it'll give you a 1 or greater number. So if you did want to convert that into a true-false value, you could. There's also the ability to check and see what the current action is. So you see this echo current action. Essentially, all that would do is output save post, right? So we added a function to save post, and we call current action inside of that, and it tells us what action is actually happening. And this is a good example of just a basic callback, right? So I didn't give you the example of what my function might look like, but in this case, we know that save post gives us the post ID, the post. It actually also gives us an update variable, but we really only need post ID for whatever we're doing here, which actually we're not using it, but in the example. But we don't need to pass a priority or a number of arguments. We automatically know that there will be at least one argument available, and we can just go ahead and take advantage of that. There's also something called doing action, which sounds a lot like current action, but there is a difference. Essentially, current action tells you what the last fired action was, where doing action tells you if it's actually processing that action currently. That's probably not something you'll use very often, but if you really need to know if something is currently happening, then that's the way you would do that. So filters are kind of the next category, right? So we have actions, we have filters. A filter basically allows you to edit some sort of data or alter some sort of variable. So essentially what WordPress does is it says, I've got this information stored in a variable. I'm going to hand it off and see if any plugins or themes want to edit that thing. And then whatever they give back to me, I'm going to use it. So kind of a more everyday example, I guess. When Jack hands you his Rubik's Cube, solve it for him and hand it back to him. So if somebody comes up and say, hey, I've got this Rubik's Cube, and you happen to be the Rubik's Cube genius, you take it, you solve it, boom, you hand it back. That's essentially what happens with filters, right? WordPress says, hey, I've got this thing, you want to work with it? You say yes, and then when you're done with it, you hand it back, and hopefully everything's better for it. So there's the handoff of the variable from WordPress, and then your ability to manipulate that thing. And this is the Twitter challenge slide. You should get a picture of this slide and come up with some genius tweet and send it out. I figured it was a good random word that would make sense for that. So kind of going on the filters, right? So we have, the first thing we have is this thing called apply filters. And this is kind of like the trigger for the handoff per se. So basically what's happening here is we have this thing called show admin bar. And show admin bar is the name of the filter, so that we can hook into that thing. And then we have the show admin bar variable. And that show admin bar variable is basically some code that's actually in WordPress. And that value is going to be true or false. By default, it's usually true. And you can actually turn off that little bar that you see at the top when you're logged in by changing this variable from true to false. So basically, all WordPress is doing is saying, hey, I have this thing, I'm going to call it show admin bar, and I'm going to pass you this variable, and then whatever you send me back, that's what the new show admin bar variable is set to. So we have some options in ways that we can work with that, right? So we have this thing called add filter. So this is a lot similar to your add action. Works the same way. You have priorities, you have a number of arguments. You can use all the same ways of registering those things. You'll see I've got a slightly different example on the first line there. So there is a WordPress function called _return_false. And all that function does is return false. So instead of having to actually register some custom function and basically return false inside of it, kind of like we do on this bottom example here. Well, except that we didn't actually set false. You can actually do some stuff like that, where if you just know you want to return a specific value, WordPress has this function available, and you can easily tell it, hey, I just want this to not be set to true, so that I don't get the admin bar.
If you set that to false, that first filter, even if you, let's say if you had an admin bar showing an admin section, will that still not show it? Will that override the admin?
That will turn it off everywhere if you unconditionally just say, show admin bar false.
You could, and you could never turn it back on with the admin pane, right?
Right, yeah. You could put, yeah, it actually, there's an interface in WordPress where you can actually manipulate that.
Yeah.
And if you were to go and like try to turn it on and click save, it would just not be on.
It'll override it.
Because this overrides it, yeah. So.
Is there also a return true?
There is. There's a return true. There's a return 0, I think. There's a number of them. So it'd be, you know, something you might want to look into, all the different functions that we've got. So yeah, just look for _return, and you'll find all their nice little helper functions. And again, you can remove filters in much the same way. So instead of saying remove action, you just say remove filter, and so on. Oh, the one thing I didn't cover, right? So when you're working with actions, you just do your own thing, and then when your code's done running, WordPress steps back in, does its thing, right? With filters, WordPress is giving you a variable, and if you don't actually return that variable back, then essentially what WordPress has to work with instead of the value it had before is null, which is not very helpful in most cases. So if it's expecting a true or false, and we return null, it will probably evaluate to the same thing as returning false. But if, for example, you happen to do this with your post content, you then forgot to return the actual value of the post content after you changed it, then all your content disappears. Meaning that you don't see your content. It's still there in the database, but essentially what you've done is you've wiped all of that stuff. So you have to make sure that whatever WordPress gives you, you actually give it back. So we have remove filter, and then in the same way we have remove all filters, where you can remove all of the show admin bar filters or all the show admin bar filters at a particular priority. Again, you can check to see if something has the filter. So we can actually check to see if the return false was registered here. And again, we can do the current filter as well. So this is a little bit more proper example, I guess I should say. We have the show admin bar, and we're registering a custom function called disable admin bar, which gets the variable show admin bar, and we return it back at the end, and we set it false in there as well. But the extra thing we threw in there, just for example here, is echo current filter, which again works a lot like echo current action, and just tells you what the last triggered filter was. And again, doing filter tells you what is currently running. So it's very possible that you trigger code, it triggers an action or a filter, which actually triggers another action or filter, which triggers another action or filter. And if you want to know exactly what one is currently being processed, this will tell you what's actually being processed as opposed to what happened to be the last prior thing, which is what current filter is. And there's one thing that's missing as far as functions go from the filter side of things, for good reason. With actions, you have this did action, right, which tells you if this action occurred. Because actions are more like events, right? Things happen in some sort of sequential manner. It would make sense that you want to know if that thing has occurred yet, or maybe how many times it's happened. With filters, that's really not important, so you're not going to have that particular equivalent for filters. So just make that clear. So now we come to the pop quiz section. So first question, And I always like to hear everybody else's, I guess, abbreviated explanations of what an action and filter is. So anybody got a good way that they like to explain it, or anything?
Difference between action and filter?
Yeah.
Filter returns a true false value, where you have to specify a return value, whereas action you don't.
Yeah, that's essentially the main thing. Yeah. So I heard David Laeta actually has a kind of a, I don't know if he realizes that it went so well, but I heard him say it. An action allows you to do something. A filter allows you to do something to something. It's kind of an easy thing to remember. It basically says the same thing. So what type of function can't be removed via remove action or remove filter?
The one where you define it in line.
Inline? Yeah. Anybody remember the name? What it's called? Anonymous functions, yeah. So now this one's a little bit trickier. So what is the open-close principle and how does it apply to WordPress hooks? We didn't talk about this. I'm just curious if anybody has thoughts on it.
Do you know the answer?
I do, yeah. So a lot of times when you're learning things like object-oriented programming, you learn about solid and all the principles. And open-close principle is the O in solid. But really, I mean, WordPress, while they're moving towards kind of an object-oriented approach, I mean, a lot of their code's not object-oriented. But these principles aren't really just object-oriented principles, right? They're general programming principles. So the open-close principle says that things should be open for extension, but closed for modification. So if you're writing code and you have a plugin, you don't want people hacking on your plugin, it makes sense that you would want to use something like actions and filters so that you can give them the ability to extend what you've created without giving them the ability to modify it. So just from a general programming standpoint, the actions and filters that WordPress uses and that whole system that they've created is actually kind of what's driven the growth of WordPress, because now WordPress isn't just a blogging system, right? It's a whole lot more. There's 43,000 plugins that can extend WordPress in any number of ways, not to mention we could write our own code and do whatever we want with it, provided that the actions and filters are there. So, figured we got a little time for a quick demo. So I'm going to give some examples of ways that we can customize WordPress. Simple things that we can do quickly, but actually give you some real-life examples of what you can do in the power of it. So one of the first things that you can do is register post types, right? So in order to run any code inside of a plugin or inside of a theme, you have to use WordPress hooks, right? Otherwise, you're just maybe you happen to put it in the theme functions file and that code runs, but it would run the second that file loads if you're not using actions, which really is not good because you're just like randomly running code just because some file loaded, which is usually not the best way to go. So what we're going to do, let's see, I think I'm going to have to stop. I think I'm going to have to mirror.
You put the code in header, right? That's a good way to do it.
All right, let's see here. All right. So this is my local development. So I've got WordPress. There's this 2015 theme, which is currently what I'm running over here. Got a little content and whatnot in there. So basically, there's kind of two ways you can go about it, right? So in this theme, any theme that you have usually has a functions.php file. And you can open up that file and you can put code in there. But if it happens to be, let's say, 2015, the second that you go update that theme, then all the customizations that you put in there would be lost. So the appropriate way of doing it would be to create a child theme. So 2015 child, and then create your own functions.php file and drop some code in there. Or you can create your own plugin, right? And creating a plugin is pretty simple. all it really is, and this is Hello Dolly, which comes with WordPress, and it's an example of how to write a plugin. Essentially, all you really have to do to have something show up as a plugin in WordPress is to create a comment that says plugin name and the name of the plugin, and it will actually show up in WordPress, provided that you drop that file in the plugins directory. As a best practice, it's usually a good idea to create a folder and then drop your file in it, but it'll work the same way. So we're going to go about this a couple different ways. So I actually have a directory here where I do have a child theme. So we're gonna work out of that, since that's kind of the best practice from how to do that within the theme. And then we might create a simple plugin as well, so we can see how that works. So let's go back to what we're trying to do. So we're trying to register a post type. Now typically themes shouldn't really register post types. That's something that is a plugin territory, as you can see. So what we're going to do is we're going to just create a simple plugin. And in this case, it's a simple one. But we're going to create a new directory in the plugins folder. We're going to call it sample plugin. Apparently we already have one. Demo. There we go. And then we're going to create a new file. We're going to call it the same thing, demo.php. We can call it, usually it's the best practice to call it whatever this name of the directory is. And all we're going to do is we're going to create a little file here, PHP file. Again, name. And then I'm going to save that and switch back over here. And in the back end of WordPress, I'll be able to, I'm not online, so it doesn't like that. I should be on Cub Library.
Yeah.
So basically, I'm going to find my demo plugin. And it's important to activate it. You can write a whole bunch of code and never activate your plugin and wonder why it doesn't work. We're just going to turn this thing on. And now our plugin is active. And you can see under active plugins that we have that there. So now we can actually drop code in. So the first thing we're going to do, add action. And we're going to hook into a knit, because that's typically what you do with registering a post type. And we're going to, let's say we're going to release this, so we want to follow best practices. So we're actually going to prefix our function names with the name of our plugin, demo, register, post type. And what that's going to do is that's going to give us our the name of our function or our callback that we need to create so that WordPress will run it at the appropriate time. And inside of here, we're going to just use a built-in WordPress function called register post type. And we're not going to get fancy. We're just going to call this demo.
Does it matter if you put the function before or after the action?
It really doesn't. Basically what happens is this file gets parsed by PHP and read into memory. And the code, and then it makes another pass, right, to actually run the code inside of here. And so it doesn't actually run functions in and of themselves unless they're called. So what it's actually doing is it's running the add action, whether it shows first or last, it makes no difference. Now, if you had multiple actions and you did want to, say, register 3 actions on the net and you wanted them to go in that order and you didn't set priority, they would fire in whatever order you put them in. But yeah, it really doesn't matter because that function technically doesn't get triggered except through the add action piece. So above or below, no difference. So now we're going to come over here and refresh. Does it really require? Pretty sure you can do this without RH, right? If you ever ever wonder if something's actually firing, here's one way to do it. If it's actually working, it'll kill WordPress and tell you that it's doing that. So we're getting our register post type. So essentially, I think we have to do lowercase. Let's see if that's the case. Forget, what am I missing? Do I have to do args? Pretty sure that's optional.
Yeah,
It actually is telling me it is optional. But, we'll do this. Anyway, that should work. You saw that it fired. I'm not going to waste my time on debugging this at the moment. So we have the ability to register post types, and so when you do that, essentially what you get is like you'll have, instead of post, you'll have another thing down here that'll say demo, right? And what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to the next thing here. So we've got the ability to change body classes. So this is a filter, right? And body classes have to do with the markup that shows up in the theme, and usually are styled by CSS. So this sounds like something that would definitely be in a theme. So we're gonna use this filter here to control our body classes. So ultimately, what that's going to look like is we'll go into our child theme that we've got here, and we've got our functions.php, which could be the functions.php of your main theme, but as I said, that's not a best practice. So there's a bunch of other stuff in here, and you can see that we are using actions and whatnot to make things happen here. But we're just going to add to this. We're going to add not an action, but a filter. And our filter is going to be body class. And you can see I'm getting the auto completion there. And for now, I'm just going to do this inline. So this is our custom child theme. This is never going to see the light of day. So I'm just going to make this nice and easy and do it this way. So WordPress is going to give us body classes. And the first thing I like to do when I'm writing a function like this is actually make sure I return that same variable that WordPress is giving me so that we get that back, right? So what should be happening, and I think the other thing I have to make sure of is that I'm actually running the appropriate theme with the code in it, 2015 child. So now that is active, and I'm going to go on the front end. We're just going to take a look there at what the body classes currently are before we change anything. So if we take a quick look, all right, so here's the opening body tag in our HTML, and it's probably a little difficult to see. There we go. So these are our body classes: home, blog, logged in, admin bar, custom background, customized support. So, and actually that show admin bar filter we were talking about before, it actually uses the body class to add the admin bar class name if the admin bar is intended to show. So WordPress uses all these much like you would if you were writing your own code. But what we are going to do is we're going to add some custom class name. So we are going to make it something unique and easy to recognize that is not a WordPress default. So we're going to add diddly squat to our page. And, oh. Yeah. So, and the other thing here is that this is actually giving us an array, and we just try to set body classes, not just an array. We want to add to that array, so that's how we do that there. So once we do that correctly, we'll have our body classes. So now you see we've got diddly squat as body class, and we can style against it. So we could potentially check any condition that we wanted to, right? So if we wanted to get creative, what we could do is we could say, you know what, for this particular page, my sample page, WordPress has support for custom fields. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this thing called last name. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to pass in class 1, class 2, featured thing, and I'll have all those saved as custom class names. And so all of those are there. What I could then do is come over here and say, you know what we are going to do is we're going to get the current post, and we're going to see if, and this may be new to some people, you actually have the ability to do, that's what we call it, right? Last name. So has anybody ever done this before? Where you probably should make this bigger. So you have a post and you're doing something like this to get the post meta. So normally you would have the ability to do, or you would do something like this: get post meta, post ID, class name, true, which is really long. But WordPress actually gives you the ability to kind of shortcut that using what's called virtual properties.
Is that new?
As of like WordPress 3.2.
So, no.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Old.
Got it.
Yeah. Or it may have been 3.1, somewhere in there. So yeah, so you can actually get your class names, and what we could do instead of adding this diddly squat class is we could come in and say, now let's just add the things that we've put in here. So now when we go to the view for this particular page, and we look at the markup, we can see we have class 1, class 2, featured thing, et cetera, but if we go to, say, the home page, all those aren't there. So now we have the ability to insert our own custom class names per page. So if we wanted to be able to easily style them, all we got to do is just drop a class name in there and then do some styling and we're done. So lots of cool things that you can do with things like that. So another thing that we can do is alter content. So so let's say we have our post, right? So we've got, let's get rid of this. So this is our Hello World post, right? So this is the actual post. We've got a bunch of lorem ipsum stuff. And what I'm going to do is, you typically see the plugin demos where you append content to the end, which is entirely possible, right? So add filter the content, and what you can do is you can again have your callback function, and what you would return is content, and then you would expect to get content from WordPress, and then you could do something with that content, right? So like I said, if you don't return, what will happen is you will basically say, hey WordPress, I saw that you have content and I'm just not going to get it back to you. In which case, that goes away. But if you properly return from a filter, you'll actually get all your stuff the way you expect. Let's say we wanted to add the current date at the top of the post for some reason. So we could do content equals date y content. Except we may want to put a little bit of HTML in there. And now we'll put our date in there. So we can prepend or append anything we want. So if you wanted to put at the end of every post written by Micah Wood or whatever it might be, so you get credit. If somebody tries to swipe content off your site, they're getting this little thing that says where this content came from. The other kinds of things you can do, you can do replacements, right? So WordPress actually has the ability where you can, like for example, with comments, right? You can moderate comments or have words that are blacklisted or things like that. You might have contributors contributing to your site, and some of them like to use bad language in their posts, and your editor doesn't catch anything, right? So you could actually write something that says, hey, if somebody uses a bad word, we're going to change it with a more user-friendly word, right? But you could also do something that might help for SEO, right? So let's say we have the word WordPress, and so we're going to look for the word WordPress. We're going to replace it with some HTML, and that HTML is basically going to be a link, right? That points you to WordPress.org. So now what happens is when we set our content to that, it says we're missing the, we have to pass it. So now what will happen, and you'll not see it right now, is if we happen to use the word WordPress on here, it's going to convert that into a link. So let's go in and we'll change, what is it? Hello world. We'll put the word WordPress right here. So now you get anywhere that you have anywhere on your site in the content, if you happen to use the word WordPress, it now links to WordPress.org. So if you happen to make all your money off affiliate marketing and you mentioned WP Engine, you want to link directly to your affiliate page, you could do that. So lots of cool things that you can do with not a whole lot of code. WordPress gives you this functionality and makes it pretty easy. It gives you all the variables and context that you might need to do some pretty cool stuff. So we're going to switch back here for just a second. So moving on to a few resources. So I'm going to, I haven't yet, I'm going to post these on the slides on SlideShare and probably tweet out a link or whatever. But there's some resources here. There's some good articles. I've picked a couple that were pretty decent that kind of cover what I talked about today, and some in different ways. So if you need a easier or a more in-depth explanation, you can find that. But the codex actually has a good reference here, and I guess might have beat the gun, because now I need to show you my screen. So there is a page here, WordPress action reference. So if you're kind of curious as to what actions there are or things that you can do with WordPress from this standpoint, these are things that run on a typical request, right? So you have, again, this MU plugins. There's a whole bunch of other things that fire. These red ones just mean that somebody hasn't created a page explaining what that is, but doesn't mean you can't use it. So there's all kinds of things that fire and happen. You'll notice that a lot of the more common ones are the ones that are in blue here. So there's things like pre-get posts where a lot of times you'll see people, they might try to customize a query for a particular page, and they'll use something like query posts, which is really bad because it actually makes two queries happen. But you can use something like pre-get posts, and you actually have the ability to tap into the query and do things like change the number of posts you get back, or even completely override it if you wanted to and make it be for some other post type or thing. So there's a lot of actions and things. You'll see that WP head, that's kind of the required hook that you have to put into your theme. WP head and WP footer. Those actually make a lot of plugins work, right? Because if a plugin needs to load a JavaScript or CSS file on the page, then they would actually end up, if that wasn't in the theme, their code would never work. But you as a plugin developer, if you needed to add a style or script, you would actually hook those in using WP and Q scripts. So there's a lot of different things, and then you can see that there's this whole other section, which is the actions that are run in the order that they're run on a typical admin page. So you can see that there is some difference. You still get things like the init action, but you also get things like admin init. So if you wanted to do something just in the WordPress admin and not for the front end of the site, you could tap into that. But a lot of the same things, but again, you'll see that we have things like admin footer and some other admin specific things that you wouldn't get otherwise. And you can look them up by category. So an easy way to kind of find, if you have an idea of what you're trying to do, you can look up and say, hey, I want to make sure I do this thing before the theme is loaded, or maybe after the theme is loaded, whatever the case may be, and you can find the right hook based off of kind of this list. The easiest way for me is I just figure out what I want to do and go look it up in the code. But yeah, so we're...
Use the Hooker plugin.
Okay, yeah, I've not played around with it, but I have heard people talk about it. So.
It's good for people like me who don't have the depth of knowledge in terms of what happens first.
Right.
It just shows you all the hooks on the page.
Yeah, and the nice thing about that, so there's a plugin called just Hooker, right?
Right.
And I'm sure if they ever had a WordPress booth, they'd have some interesting swag. But so, anyways, the good thing about that is, as opposed to that list I just showed you, where you actually have just the actions that happen in WordPress. When you have other plugins running on your site, Hooker will actually show you all of them. So if you have Gravity Forms, it'll show you all the Gravity Forms things you can hook into. Or if you have WordPress SEO and you want to use something with that, it'll show you all those things. So it actually kind of gives you a customized view for your own site.
It's really good for things like WooCommerce, where they have all these things and you're trying to find something, a specific spot on the page to change something.
Yeah. So yeah, very good. I probably should add that to the resource list.
Where do you go to find out what you can hook onto it for your SEO?
Say that again?
You were talking about you can look at all the hooks for Gravity Forms and yours.
Yeah, so typically a lot of the plugins, good plugins, will document all those things for you. So I know, like for WooCommerce, they have a whole page dedicated to here are all the filters and all the actions that we have. And you can even, I think, browse them by like version of the plugin. Not all plugins are that good at documenting things. Some decide just not to document them, and if you happen to find out that there's a hook there you can use, go for it, but we're not going to tell you about it. But yeah, a lot of the good plugins like WordPress SEO and that kind of thing, they'll have documentation about that. But again, that plugin, even if you have plugins that didn't document it, you could actually see like where things are on the page and what you can hook into. So for the except it's the plugin, right? There it is. Yeah, so this plugin here would take a few screenshots.
Music pages are really ugly and hard to read.
Right. But yeah, so there's some good stuff there. Any questions or other things I may not have mentioned? General question?
So you go to documentation to look up hooks for those? Or?
Yeah, so I'm thinking you look up WordPress SEO, right? And you go to here, you should be able to, under FAQ generally, well, of course he has it on his site. Except for the fact that they just sold this plugin to Syed and his company. So yeah, documentation might be harder to find now that page is not pulling up. But again, like if you run this thing here, it'll show you like where on the page things you could insert things. But I've done some interesting integrations with WordPress SEO stuff. So if there's something particular you're trying to do, let me know. Any other questions, comments? Cool. So I guess if I tweet out these slides, where should I tweet them to?
Yeah, get them to us and we'll post them. We'll embed them on the
Meetup.
video. So.
Cool. All right. Well, I guess that's what I've got then. Cool. Thanks.